History loves to paint explorers as fearless pioneers, bold visionaries who charted the unknown. Cute. The reality? Half the time they didn't know where they were going, what they were doing, or how to not die from basic weather. This isn't a tribute to bravery. It's a guided tour through a museum of epic miscalculations, tragic overconfidence, and decisions so brainless they'd get you banned from Google Maps. Get ready to meet the so-called legends of exploration, many of whom had the instincts of a broken compass and the luck of a drunk pigeon. 1. So Vasco da Gama, the legendary navigator, finally makes it to India. He lands a meeting with a king so rich he probably used diamonds as ice cubes. This is the first impression for all of Western civilization. And Vasco rolls up with a gift bag that looks like he won it at a sad carnival. I'm talking cheap cloth, some hats that were probably already out of style in Portugal, and a few wash basins. Wash basins. He tried to impress a literal emperor with plumbing fixtures. The king's officials took one look at this pathetic pile and basically told him, "You can't show this to the boss. He'll think we're being pranked." This man sailed across the globe just to prove that even a legendary hero can have the gift-giving instincts of a clueless uncle at Christmas. 2. Martin Frobisher was an explorer who operated on one simple principle. If it's shiny, it must be valuable. So when he found some black rock in Canada, he didn't bother with boring stuff like, testing it. He just declared it gold and sailed back to England as a hero. He then convinced the entire country to fund a second trip where his only goal was to become the world's most ambitious rock collector. He hauled 1,500 tons of this junk across the Atlantic. When he got back, the experts basically said, "Hey Martin, congrats. You've discovered the heaviest, most useless paperweight on Earth." The so-called national treasure was eventually crushed up and used to pave roads. The man's legacy isn't a city of gold, it's a slightly sparkly B-road somewhere in the English countryside. 3. Christopher Columbus had been at sea for so long, his brain was starting to see things that weren't there. So when his crew spotted a pod of large, lumpy sea creatures, his mind didn't log it as new fauna. It screamed mermaids. But here's where it goes from a simple mistake to high comedy. He then had the audacity to write a bad review of them in his journal, complaining that they were not as beautiful as they are painted. He was looking at a manatee, a 1,000-pound blubbery sea cow that looks like a sentient floating sweet potato. This is like getting catfished by an animal and then leaving a 1-star Yelp review on the entire species for not meeting your ridiculous beauty standards. The man discovered a new world and still found time to be a bitter critic. 4. If you thought Frobisher's rock-collecting hobby was a one-off, let me introduce you to Jacques Cartier, who apparently saw that failure and thought, "I can do that, but dumber." When locals in Canada told him about nearby gold and diamonds, probably just to see if he'd fall for it, Cartier lost his mind. He and his crew completely abandoned their actual job of, founding a colony for France. Instead, they spent their time digging up shiny rocks like hyperactive squirrels. They raced back to France, ready for a life of luxury, only to be told their haul was worthless fool's gold and quartz. He failed so spectacularly that France literally created an insult in his honor, as fake as a Canadian diamond. Imagine being so bad at your job that you become a permanent part of the national vocabulary for being a loser. 5. Marco Polo's travel stories were legendary, but some of them read like a guy trying to describe a zoo animal to someone who's only ever seen cartoons. When he got to Sumatra, he was ecstatic because he thought he'd finally found a real-life unicorn. But his journal entry sounds less like a magical discovery and more like a disappointed customer complaint. He whined that they were ugly brutes, that they loved rolling in mud, and had the head of a boar. He was, of course, looking at a rhinoceros. The man saw a 2-ton prehistoric armored vehicle with a giant spike on its face, and his main takeaway was, "Well, this isn't nearly as graceful as I'd imagined." It's the ultimate case of reality not living up to the fantasy, and Marco Polo was there to document his crushing disappointment for all of history. 6. Christopher Columbus's relationship with math was, to put it lightly, hostile. To get his trip funded, he needed the world to be a lot smaller. So he did what any motivated person with no respect for facts does. He just decided it was. He cherry-picked some ancient, discredited data, ignored every smart person of his era, and basically presented a version of the globe where the Pacific Ocean was a small pond. But his true genius for being wrong shone through, even after he landed. He was so convinced that Cuba was a part of mainland China that he made his entire crew sign a legally binding document swearing it was true. It was the 15th century equivalent of your boss forcing you to sign a paper agreeing that the sky is green and that anyone who disagrees is a traitor. 7. The Spanish had a playbook for conquest, and step 1 was a piece of bureaucratic nonsense called the requerimiento. This was a long, boring legal document that a priest had to read out loud, in Spanish, to the local villagers they were about to attack. It explained the entire history of the world according to them, and demanded immediate surrender to a king they'd never heard of. It was like showing up at someone's house, reading the entire iPhone user agreement out loud, and then getting mad when they don't immediately hand you the keys to their car. It was a completely insane, self-serving ritual that allowed them to say, "Well, we tried to be reasonable," right before they unleashed hell. It was the ultimate "I'm not touching you" move, but for conquering nations. 8. The story of Burke and Wills is a powerful reminder that procrastination can be fatal. After an insane journey across Australia, these two explorers were on their last legs, stumbling back to their supply camp. They were almost home, almost safe, almost fed. And right at that moment, they made a decision so dumb it's almost beautiful. They decided to take a nap. They took a day off to rest up before the final push. When they finally strolled into the camp, it was empty. The rescue party had left that very morning. They missed their one shot at survival by 9 hours. It's the most tragic case of hitting the snooze button in recorded history. They died not because the outback was too tough, but because they were the undisputed world champions of putting things off until tomorrow. 9. William Dampier was a man of many talents, and most of them contradicted each other. On one hand, he was a brilliant naturalist who made some of the first detailed English records of exotic plants and animals. On the other hand, his main job, his 9-to-5, was being a ruthless, swashbuckling pirate. Imagine trying to write a detailed scientific paper on the breeding habits of the Galapagos tortoise while your crew is in the middle of plundering a Spanish galleon. His life was a constant battle between intellectual curiosity and the urgent need to steal gold. His journals are this bizarre mix of the unique dorsal fin of the local fish, followed by, "We then set fire to the town and drank all their rum." He was less of an explorer and more of a heavily armed, deeply conflicted researcher who just happened to be committing felonies for a living. 10. George Gray was an explorer in Australia who learned a valuable lesson. Never get into a food fight with an entire continent's worth of insects. While on a brutal expedition, he had the clever idea to bury a large stash of his supplies to retrieve on the way back. He was probably feeling pretty smart about it, like a squirrel hiding its nuts for the winter. But when he returned, exhausted and starving, he found that the local ants had thrown the party of a lifetime. They hadn't just eaten the food, they had eaten everything. The flour was gone, the sugar was gone, and just to add insult to injury, they had devoured the leather bags the food was in, and even the corks from his bottles. He was outsmarted by creatures with brains the size of a dust particle. It was a total, humiliating defeat delivered by an army of tiny, six-legged thieves. 11. Zebulon Pike was an American explorer who was given a seemingly simple job. Go explore the southern part of the Louisiana Purchase and try not to get lost. He failed spectacularly at the second part. Pike had a sense of direction so terrible he could probably get lost in his own living room. He wandered aimlessly for months, completely missing his targets until he accidentally stumbled deep into Spanish territory in what is now Colorado. The Spanish soldiers who found him were utterly confused. They weren't sure if he was a spy, an invader, or just the most incompetent tourist they had ever seen. They arrested him, confiscated all his maps, which were probably just crayon drawings of squirrels anyway, and politely escorted him out of their country. He got a mountain named after him, but he basically discovered it by tripping over it. 12. René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle, was a French explorer with big dreams of creating a massive French empire in North America. His final expedition was supposed to establish a colony at the mouth of the Mississippi River. The problem was, he missed it by 400 miles. It's like trying to find New York City and ending up in North Carolina. After landing his ships in modern-day Texas, he spent 2 years wandering around the swampy coastline, desperately trying to find the giant river he had somehow misplaced. His men, who were tired of his terrible leadership and even worse navigation, finally had enough. They staged a mutiny, which mostly consisted of them ambushing La Salle and murdering him in the middle of nowhere. It was a brutal end for a man whose ambition was only matched by his stunning inability to read a map. 13. Henry Hudson was a legendary English explorer, mostly famous for having a giant bay, a strait, and a river named after him. What they don't mention on the plaque is that he was such a colossal jerk to his crew that they decided they'd rather take their chances with the Arctic than spend another day with him. After a brutal winter stuck in the ice, his starving and frostbitten crew was ready to go home. Hudson wanted to keep exploring. This disagreement ended with the crew throwing Hudson, his teenage son, and a few loyal sailors into a tiny boat and setting them adrift in the middle of the massive, freezing bay that now bears his name. He was the ultimate horrible boss, the kind of manager who gets a mutiny as his performance review. He got his name on the map, but it was basically his own giant watery tombstone. 14. Captain James Cook was one of the most brilliant navigators in history. He mapped more of the planet than anyone before him. But his final visit to Hawaii proves that even a genius can make a fatal social blunder. When his ships first arrived, the Hawaiians treated him like a god, thinking he was the embodiment of their deity Lono. But after leaving and then being forced to return for repairs, his timing was terrible. He came back during a sacred festival where, according to their beliefs, the god Lono was not supposed to be there. The locals went from treating him like a divinity to seeing him as a very inconvenient party crasher. Tensions boiled over, a fight broke out on the beach, and the man who had survived uncharted reefs and Antarctic ice was brought down by a misunderstanding over religious scheduling. It was the deadliest possible case of showing up at the wrong time. 15. Giovanni da Verrazzano was a Florentine explorer working for France who did some excellent mapping of the American East Coast. He was a pro. But on a later voyage to the Caribbean, his confidence got the better of him. He anchored his ship off an island that looked peaceful enough and, against the advice of his crew, decided to row ashore with a small party to greet the locals. The locals greeted him. All right. They immediately killed him, dismembered him, and cooked and ate him right there on the beach, in full view of his horrified crew still on the ship. The crew could only watch in terror as their captain was turned into an afternoon barbecue. It's a gruesome but powerful reminder that assuming everyone you meet is friendly is a terrible survival strategy, especially when you're the main course. 16. Ferdinand Magellan is credited with being the first person to circumnavigate the globe. Well, sort of. His expedition was the first. He, on the other hand, was not. Why? Because he got himself killed in a completely pointless fight he had no business being in. While in the Philippines, he decided to show off his European military might by helping a local king he'd just met attack a rival village on another island. Magellan, brimming with overconfidence, told his new friend to just sit back and watch how a real professional handles things. He stormed the beach with a tiny force, expecting the enemy to be terrified. They were not. They were very angry. Magellan was overwhelmed and hacked to death in the shallow water. He didn't die for glory or discovery. He died because he decided to play the tough guy in someone else's neighborhood dispute. 17. Francisco de Orellana deserves a special award for most successful failure in the history of exploration. He was part of a larger Spanish expedition searching for El Dorado, the mythical city of gold. When the main group got bogged down in the jungle, Orellana was sent downriver with a small boat and a few men to find food. He was supposed to be back in a few days. Instead, he just kept going. Whether he got lost, realized the main party was doomed, or just saw an opportunity for a legendary joyride, we'll never know. He floated down the entire length of the Amazon River, a journey of thousands of miles through uncharted territory, eventually popping out in the Atlantic Ocean. He became the first European to navigate the world's largest river purely by accident. He set out to find a snack and ended up discovering a continent's worth of geography. 18. Imagine being the first person in human history to see an entirely new continent, a landmass of ice the size of the United States and Mexico combined, and just not really noticing. That's the story of Fabian von Bellingshausen, a Russian explorer who was circumnavigating Antarctica. He got incredibly close to the mainland, close enough to see the towering ice cliffs of the Antarctic Peninsula. He logged it in his journal as an ice shore of extreme height. But the sheer, mind-boggling significance of what he was looking at seemed to completely fly over his head. He didn't plant a flag or shout "Eureka." He just kind of went, "Huh, that's a lot of ice," and sailed on. It's the historical equivalent of stumbling upon Mount Everest and describing it in your notes as a pointy hill. A truly epic discovery met with a truly epic shrug. 19. Abel Tasman was a Dutch explorer who had an uncanny talent for finding small islands while completely missing the gigantic landmasses right next to them. He was sent on a mission to figure out how big Australia was. On his voyage, he discovered Tasmania, which he named Van Diemen's Land, and then sailed on to discover New Zealand and Fiji. He found all these amazing places, but he somehow managed to sail around almost the entire continent of Australia without ever actually seeing it. It's like trying to find an elephant in a small room, but getting distracted by all the interesting mice scurrying around its feet. He was a phenomenal sailor, but his ability to overlook the obvious was truly world-class. He had one job, map the big thing, and he found everything but. 20. Percy Fawcett was an English explorer who became dangerously obsessed with finding a mythical lost city in the Amazon, which he called the Lost City of Zeb. His evidence for its existence was flimsy at best, based on a few old documents and a whole lot of wishful thinking. But he was convinced. He dragged his son and his son's friend into the middle of the jungle on a quest that was less a scientific expedition and more a personal fantasy. Predictably, they all vanished without a trace. Fawcett wasn't just an explorer. He was the original ancient aliens guy, a man so determined to believe in a fantastical story that he walked his entire family into the jungle and straight into oblivion. He went looking for a lost city and ended up becoming a lost person, which is a pretty ironic final chapter. 21. The Vikings were the first Europeans to reach North America about 500 years before Columbus. But the story of how they found it is hilariously anticlimactic. A Viking trader named Bjarni Herjolfsson was trying to sail from Iceland to Greenland to visit his dad. He got blown off course by a storm and ended up sighting the coast of what was likely Newfoundland. Did he land? Did he explore? Did he claim it for the Viking Empire? Nope. He wasn't interested. He was in a hurry. He literally looked at an entire new continent, said, "That's not Greenland," and turned his boat around. It's the most profound case of "Are we there yet?" in history. He was so focused on his original destination that he sailed right past one of the most important discoveries ever made, with a level of indifference that is truly legendary. 22. In the 19th century, a popular theory among so-called experts was the idea of an open polar sea. They believed that beyond the ring of ice surrounding the Arctic, there was a warm, navigable ocean waiting to be discovered. An American explorer named Elisha Kane was completely obsessed with this idea. He was convinced it was real, despite all evidence to the contrary. He led a doomed expedition deep into the Arctic, dragging his men and his ship further and further into the ice, certain that any day now they'd break through into this magical, warm sea. They never did. Instead, their ship got permanently frozen in place, and they were forced to endure a nightmare of starvation and frostbite. Kane's obsession with a fantasy ocean led his men directly into a very real frozen hell. 23. James Bruce was a Scottish explorer who was determined to be the man who found the source of the Nile River, one of the greatest geographical mysteries of the age. After years of hardship in Africa, he finally arrived at Lake Tana in Ethiopia and saw the springs that fed into it. He triumphantly declared that he had found the source of the Nile. The problem was, he'd only found the source of the Blue Nile, which is just one of the river's two major tributaries. The real, more distant source of the White Nile was hundreds of miles away. But Bruce wasn't about to let a little detail like that ruin his big moment. He went back to Europe, wrote a book, and claimed all the glory. It's like claiming you invented the car because you successfully put the key in the ignition. 24. Louis-Antoine de Bougainville was a French explorer who decided it would be a brilliant idea to establish a French colony on the Falkland Islands. It was a windy, desolate, and strategically useless pile of rocks in the middle of the South Atlantic. But he did it anyway. Almost immediately, the Spanish, who had long claimed the islands, found out and were furious. Then the British, who also had their eye on the islands, got involved. Bougainville's little pet project, his pointless little colony, nearly dragged three of Europe's major powers into a full-blown war over a bunch of sheep-covered rocks. It was a masterclass in how to create an international incident out of thin air. He eventually had to pack up and leave, having achieved nothing but making everyone angry. 25. Matthew Flinders was the legendary explorer who first circumnavigated and named the continent of Australia. A true hero of navigation. His reward for this monumental achievement? Getting arrested and thrown in jail for 6 years because of a paperwork problem. After his grueling journey, he was forced to stop for repairs at the French-controlled island of Mauritius. Unfortunately, Britain and France were at war, and the local French governor was a suspicious, petty man who decided Flinders' scientific passport wasn't in order. Despite Flinders being a world-famous scientist on a peaceful mission, the governor accused him of being a spy and imprisoned him. The man who charted an entire continent spent the next 6 years stuck on a tiny island, fighting a one-man war against the world's most stubborn and unreasonable bureaucrat. It's the ultimate proof that no achievement is too great to be undone by a small-minded official with a rulebook. 26. The Franklin expedition was supposed to be the glorious final chapter in the search for the Northwest Passage. It was the most technologically advanced polar expedition ever assembled, with 2 huge ships and enough supplies to last for years. One of their most high-tech features was a massive supply of canned food. The problem was, the company that won the contract to supply the cans did a rush job. The lead soldering on the inside of the cans was sloppy and leaked directly into the food. So while the men were slowly freezing in the Arctic, they were also slowly poisoning themselves with every meal. They were trapped on ships that were essentially giant, floating lead poisoning machines. It was a cutting-edge technological solution that only managed to make their slow, agonizing deaths even more certain. 27. Gerardus Mercator is the man who created the map projection that we still see everywhere today. A true genius of cartography. However, some of his other ideas were, to put it mildly, completely bonkers. He was absolutely convinced that the North Pole wasn't just ice, but was actually a giant, black magnetic mountain called the Rupes Nigra. According to him, this mountain was surrounded by a giant whirlpool that sucked the oceans into the center of the Earth, and was flanked by 4 continents separated by 4 powerful rivers. He drew this on his official maps. One of the most important map makers in history was confidently charting a landscape that sounds like it was ripped straight out of a bad fantasy novel. It just goes to show that you can be a genius in one area and a complete lunatic in another. 28. Vitus Bering was a Danish explorer working for the Russian Tsar, put in charge of the Great Northern Expedition, one of the largest and most expensive scientific ventures in history. He had a massive budget, huge ships, and hundreds of men. His goal was to map the eastern reaches of Siberia and find out if Asia was connected to America. After years of effort, his ship was wrecked on a desolate, treeless island. There, Bering, the commander of this colossal expedition, the man with access to virtually unlimited resources, died. His cause of death? Scurvy. A simple vitamin C deficiency. He died from the most cliché and preventable sailor's disease imaginable while leading the most well-funded expedition on the planet. It's like the CEO of a nutrition company dying of a junk food overdose. 29. Roald Amundsen was the undisputed king of polar exploration. He conquered the South Pole and the Northwest Passage. But his attempt to fly over the North Pole was a spectacular fiasco. He and his partner decided to use two massive, clumsy Dornier flying boats, which were about as suitable for landing on ice as a bowling ball is for ballet. Predictably, they crash-landed in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. They then spent nearly a month frantically trying to carve a functioning runway out of the shifting sea ice with nothing but pocket knives in sheer panic. They were elite explorers who had placed themselves in a situation so stupid that they had to rely on pure, dumb luck to survive. They eventually managed to take off, but only after proving that even heroes can make terrible transportation choices. 30. When the Spanish conquistador Hernando de Soto set out to explore what is now the southeastern United States, he brought along the usual tools of conquest: swords, guns, and armor. But he also brought along a secret weapon: a herd of pigs. These weren't just for food, they were a walking, squealing biological time bomb. The pigs bred at an astonishing rate, and many escaped, becoming a feral swine population that ran rampant across the land. More importantly, they were carriers of European diseases to which the native animal and human populations had no immunity. De Soto's pigs didn't just eat local crops. They likely kicked off devastating epidemics that wiped out entire communities long before the Spanish even arrived. He was an explorer, a conqueror, and, unintentionally, the Johnny Appleseed of plague-ridden bacon. 31. When you think of crossing a desert, what animal comes to mind? If you're a normal person, you think of a camel. If you're Robert Burke and William Wills, the famously doomed leaders of the Victorian exploring expedition in Australia, you also think of a camel. The problem is, Australia isn't just a desert. It has vast regions of muddy plains and dense bush that are a nightmare for a camel's wide, soft feet. The camels struggled, sank in the mud, and became more of a burden than a help. In a final, grimly ironic twist, after the camels had outlived their usefulness as transport, they found a new purpose. They became the main course for the starving, desperate explorers. The animals they brought to conquer the continent ended up being their last pathetic meals. 32. Sir Francis Drake, the legendary English privateer and explorer, was a man who loved to annoy the Spanish. During his circumnavigation of the globe, he sailed up the coast of California. He landed, repaired his ship, and, in a moment of pure opportunistic swagger, planted an English flag and claimed the entire region for Queen Elizabeth, calling it New Albion. And then what did he do? He left. He just sailed away. He didn't leave a colony, a fort, or even a strongly worded note. He just claimed a massive chunk of North America and then promptly forgot about it. It was the ultimate explorer's drive-by, a grand gesture that meant absolutely nothing. The Spanish, who lived next door, basically just shrugged and took it over later. 33. Robert Falcon. Scott's fatal expedition to the South Pole is a tragedy filled with poor decisions, but none were quite as baffling as his choice of transport animals. Instead of using sled dogs, the tried-and-true method for polar travel, Scott decided to bring Siberian ponies. He thought they would be better suited to hauling heavy loads. He was catastrophically wrong. The ponies' hooves sank deep into the soft Antarctic snow. They couldn't handle the extreme cold, and they required bulky food that had to be hauled with them. They quickly became exhausted, useless burdens. The final horrifying chapter of this mistake? As the ponies collapsed and died, they were butchered and eaten by the team, their bodies cached in depots as a food source for the return journey that Scott and his men would never complete. And there it is, the glorious history of getting completely, stupidly lost, dressed up as heroism. Men hailed as geniuses, fumbling through jungles, oceans, and entire continents like it was their first time outside. But now the power's in your hands. Imagine you're a broke 15th century king with just enough gold for one more doomed expedition. Who do you fire first to save your crown? Columbus? the map denier who bet everything on a math error? Or Frobisher, the man who mistook shiny rocks for riches and dragged literal garbage across the Atlantic? Drop your pick in the comments and defend it, brutally,